everyone. So a lot of this is based on working in the Global South as an internationalization practitioner. But a lot of it is also based on working with the likes of Sylvie and Jenna, who bring out the best in me somehow. The title of my talk today is Aren't All Students International? But the title is just a provocation to draw people in. That's, as you will see, that's not all I'm going to talk about. So let me begin. Aren't all students international? I thought I would speculate today on the implications of delinking travel from being an international student. In the first instance, this would amount to acknowledging the eco-planetary concerns stemming from unrestrained long-distance mobility. But I will further suggest that this definitional rejig reveals the need for all students, including those hitherto labeled domestic, to learn about, from, and with diverse worldviews. At the institutional level, it shifts focus away from the number of foreign passport holders enrolled to meaningful diversity in curriculum, classroom, and campus practices as authentic indicators or markers of internationalization. Excellence has come to be unquestioningly associated with claims of going international or global, especially in my part of the world. But I guess we got that from this part of the world. This proposed conceptual move that I'm talking about re-situates the quest for excellence at other levels: local, subnational, bioregional, continental, among them. In the process, indigeneity rather than ethnocentrism form the foundations for receiving other ways of being and knowing. The transhistorical imagination is then able to entertain the idea of civilization, not in terms of competition and a quest for dominance, but as an array of pathways to attain self-mastery. Some people asked me what I mean when I'm talking about the spiritual approach to internationalization. The short answer to that is thinking of intercultural dialogue as something we engage in to understand ourselves better. And that's why the reference to self-mastery here, right? Understanding that there are many paths available to us to understand ourselves better. Like, we're not walking down those paths to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and understand them, but it's about getting more clarity in reference to those paths, to the path that we've been on, right? Allowing those multiple reference points to reflect back to us how we've been living or what we've been assuming all along. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Now, the case for delinking international status from travel. I recently asked a class comprised of students studying in institutions spread across the globe whether the presence of international students in their home institutions had any impact on what they studied. The group of law students representing various universities in the Netherlands said that they hardly ever had international students joining their course of study, which is focused primarily on national law and is taught in Dutch. The group of students hailing from universities in Australia and the UK, on the other hand, confessed that despite the number of international students, and one student said that her classes were 90% international students, the class composition had left the curriculum unaltered. Existing body of literature on curriculum internationalization is founded on the assumption that when it comes to gaining intercultural competence, so-called international students have a distinct set of needs as compared to so-called home students. It is on this basis that international students are boxed into the role of bearers of cultural diversity, authentic and willing representatives of their cultural backgrounds, and simultaneously in need of integration into the host environment. Meanwhile, home students are typecast as passive beneficiaries of an intercultural learning environment, vacuum sealed from color-coded anti-immigrant discourses present in wider society, and notions of inferiority or superiority learned throughout formal education. This intercultural learning, which is supposed to be happening, which is assumed to be happening, this intercultural learning environment is supposed to enhance their employability prospects in emerging markets. Now, in case you were wondering whether I flew out 9 hours and 40 minutes to tell you that traveling is a bad idea, because that would be the huge elephant in the room right now. Let me clarify. What I am suggesting, and this is what I meant when I said that the title is actually a provocation. What I am suggesting is that the field of research with international students has advanced sufficiently for us to now confidently problematize some of our own assumptions, as well as contributing meaningfully to allied causes such as intercultural dialogue and learning. Available frameworks for developing intercultural competence are constructed around the idea of seeing difference, rather than the insight that we see when there is difference, right? You only become conscious of your own thought patterns when you're confronted with somebody else's, for example, thought pattern, which is slightly different, right? So this is what I mean by seeing difference versus we see when there is difference. Now, existing frameworks for developing intercultural competence are based on the former, like seeing difference. Okay, how do we learn about others who are different, who operate in the world and have different ways of seeing the world compared to us? It's nothing to do with seeing yourself and understanding yourself better, which is my emphasis. These commonly applied frameworks encourage students to develop tolerance for difference, rather than cultivating a keener awareness of how their lived reality creeps into their perspective, their process, and their expression. Okay? We're making people aware of everybody but themselves through intercultural competence in a very instrumental way of that. Okay? That is each. A case in point is the framework designed for the King's Warwick Graduate Pledge Project, which aims towards flexible thinking, wherein learners, 1, actively seek to understand unfamiliar behavior. And these are lines straight out of that framework. Actively seek to understand unfamiliar behavior. 2, avoid judging people from other cultures on the basis of stereotypes. And 3, acknowledge that different practices are sensible and meaningful in their cultural context and can add value to your own way of thinking. While the significance of these learning outcomes cannot be denied, I'm not saying that this is not a good starting point, it is. Even just the awareness that there are different perspectives can be a big shift for a lot of people. I'm not saying that that's not the case for all of us. While the significance of these learning outcomes cannot be denied, the framework is fundamentally other-oriented, and engagement with other ways of being is sought as a value addition to our established worldview, rather than urging us to re-examine our mental maps in any way. Literally says here, and can add value to your own way of thinking. Okay? So this is not can make you challenge your own way of thinking, but as additive to, and therefore cementing by implication your own way. Okay? So it's like we're tightening the screws rather than letting them come loose, okay? Which is the idea. At the institutional and systemic levels, such instrumental engagement, as such, the cross-cultural encounter is presented to us as a problem of managing diversity rather than an opportunity to nurture pluriversality. Why do we learn about other cultures? Because managing diversity can be such an issue, right? So the whole exercise is like fraught with this anxiety of, oh my God, like diversity is such a problem to be managed. Rather than this idea of how liberating that we have different ideas, different ways of seeing our shared challenges, and how we can therefore, because there are these different ways of viewing the world, how that leads us to maybe different solutions for our shared challenges, right? So this anxiety about diversity is what has cast a shadow over how we have understood why intercultural dialogue and intercultural learning so far. Reframing all students as international then is to spotlight learning itself and to allow intercultural interactions to reveal what is valuable learning and how it occurs. At the institutional and systemic levels, such instrumental engagement with other ways of knowing and being has primarily been motivated by a desire for harm reduction via a politics of recognition. However, its ramifications have not received due attention. As exemplified above, this approach in the Spencer Whitley, the King's Warwick Graduate College project. As exemplified in this framework, this approach entertains other ways of knowing as additive while maintaining the primacy of the dominant paradigm of knowledge creation. Thereby, the subject-object orientation of the researcher-research relationship remains the familiar hierarchy between the hegemonic industrialized core and the resource and labor abundant peripheries. Okay. At the level of strategy or policy, and this will sound familiar when we think about our institutions, tokenism is frequently resorted to by way of rhetorical moves to innocence. Instead of sanguine introspection, proclamations of diversity are mobilized to bolster pre-existing reputational capital and reinscribe the superiority of northern institutions. We are diverse not because we are really diverse, but the fact that we are diverse makes us great, right? Makes us the best. Internationalization efforts within this paradigm seek minor reform, usually in the form of cosmetic and non-performative commitments to change and tinkering with language, while in no way upsetting unequal structural relations. While these changes represent movement forward from colonial epistemicide, like this is a step forward. All of what we're doing is a step forward, right? But I mean, there are further steps forward, is what I'm saying. While these changes represent movement forward from colonial epistemicide, the imagination that informs them is fully aligned with a secure futurity for and shaped by Western modernity. At the ontological level, this paradigm places the burden of change making on the historically disadvantaged. At the epistemic level, it opens up other ways of knowing to heightened appropriation and commercialization, even as they continue to be denied any say in determining how we. Yeah, we take the knowledge and we commercialize it, but we will not recognize that the systems that created that knowledge are really something. You will not give them an equal standing with our current hegemonic dominant system. We'll take the knowledge, sure, right? We'll slap IP, intellectual property, something on it. We'll make it into powdered green juices and we use it, sure, right? But we will not recognize that, oh, like the people who must have arrived at this knowledge, the way they did it, the way they arrived at it really can teach us something. Okay, this is appropriation. It's important to also understand what the nature of appropriation is, because it's used in very casual. It's a term that's thrown around very casually, and there's very unnecessary anxiety about it. When it comes to very superficial acts of speech and dressing and all of that, but actual appropriation is so much more insidious and is so much more ingrained in our current way of living. So it's very important to understand what actual appropriation is. At the epistemic level, it opens up other ways of knowing, heightened appropriation and commercialization, even as they continue to be denied any say in determining how we know. And the emphasis here on how, we, and know. How is the how? How does the how happen? Who is the we, who are the knowers, the authoritative producers of knowledge? And what does the knowing mean, right? What is knowing? Is knowing just measuring, right? Or are there other ways of knowing? In other words, the dominant approach to knowledge creation has, with time, with student mobility in particular, the dominant approach to knowledge creation has, with time, become receptive to learners from varied backgrounds via mobility, and has arrived at an uncomfortable truce with other ways of viewing the world via diversity, equity, inclusion, policy, and practice. The next challenge it confronts is to loosen its grip on claims to legitimacy and universal validity, and make room for other ways of making sense of it. A reference to other ways of knowing the world is not the same thing as admitting that different people have different perceptions of the world. That is why more mobility simply cannot adequately respond to this challenge. The change must come from within. Not everybody gets to play to their strengths when the idea of excellence is hijacked by a set of indicators. This is especially the case when the indicators themselves are derived from discourses of worthwhile goals, ways, and outcomes of learning, which are often exclusionary even for their own context of origin. And on deeper introspection, have historically risen to prominence by silencing traditional approaches, which did not meet the standards of hegemonic science and or were otherwise socio-economically inexpedient. That Jenna was just mentioning the case of Manchester, right? Why did the factory blue-collar classes here, why did they resist import of cotton from other parts of the world? Or, as she said, getting cotton that was a result of slavery. Because the same interests that were colonizing the rest of the world had already internally colonized here and sort of brutally repressed any resistance to emerging early capitalism, right? The transition from the pre-capitalist system to capitalism. Okay, so coloniality is nothing that happens outside without happening first. Like the history of coloniality is first always internal colonization and then up. Right? Thank you. So this is what I mean when I say that the hegemonic paradigm is also hegemonic and violent in its own context. It also does not fully represent its own context. Right? So that is also very important to understand. Okay. Where was it? Yeah. This is especially the case where the indicators themselves are derived from discourses of worthwhile goals, ways, and outcomes of learning, which are often exclusionary even for their own context of origin. And on deeper introspection have historically risen to prominence by silencing traditional approaches which did not meet the standards of hegemonic science and or were otherwise socio-economically inexpedient. Was there so much persecution in the late Middle Ages in Europe? Why were there so many witch burnings across England? Because these people represented other ways of being and other ways of knowing internally, which was the first challenge posed to the new emerging system, right? And the experience of being able to do it internally is what provided the template of doing the same thing in other lands. Okay, so that is the whole history. Just as the idea of global is in fact an approximation for Western modernity, global excellence is the art of vaguely replicating practices of northern institutions, justified through the vocabulary of catch-up development in specific pockets within the peripheries. This trend hastens the planned obsolescence of rival visions for the purpose and practice of education in these locations. I synth will know what I'm saying. This trend hastens the planned obsolescence of rival visions for the purpose and practice of education in those locations, while securing for metropolitan institutions a pipeline of prospective candidates who are somewhat trained in their ways, who are half-baked in their ways, so that they can come here to get fully baked and then the icing on top. Instead, curriculum internationalization may be defined as seeking to diversify the ontological and cosmological foundations from where content, pedagogy, and assessment approaches are drawn, in case anyone was looking for a tiny definition. Prior to and alongside such diversification, efforts to encourage students to understand the formative worldviews and historical contingencies that have shaped their disciplines into their current form would be essential. The cumulative effect of such recognition and such diversification would be the localization of all knowledges. The idea of achieving excellence by attaching the prefix global loses significant ground in the process. To conclude, I am going to briefly touch on implications for researchers in the South. Complicity and self-reflection are essential components of decolonizing knowledge creation. While critique and embedded narratives are important, we in the South cannot abdicate our responsibility to contribute towards decentering concepts and frameworks and embracing liberatory methods. The first step in this pursuit is being authentic to our lived experience. This does not mean boxing oneself into ever narrower markers of identity ever more aggressively. Rather, it involves waking up to the liberatory potential that inhabiting borderlands has forever held. A deficit in advantage of any kind invariably alerts us to the world in ways that the privileged need not be. The ontology of the borderlands being one of negotiation yields, firstly, an episteme which values uncertainty and not knowing. Secondly, a methodology of embodied knowing or sensing as sense-making and making sense. And thirdly, a practice of generosity where a little goes a long way. What makes this alternative path truly unapologetic, however, is its grounding in an interdependent and cyclical cosmovision, which renders catch-up development futile by acknowledging that when it comes to hierarchical structure, when it comes to the hierarchical structure that is global higher education, what appears to be up there has already been on its way down for a while now. In conclusion, what do we most need to do as Southern scholars? Liberate ourselves, find ourselves, be ourselves, heed ourselves, own ourselves, dedicate ourselves, summon ourselves, express ourselves, unlearn and build back ourselves, fulfill ourselves. I think I'll stop before that list gets much longer. Thank you.